A wild horse stared at an elderly woman in a wheelchair. Then it did something no one expected. What happened next will leave you speechless. So let's get started with interesting story. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues over the quiet meadow. An elderly woman sat alone in her wheelchair, watching the endless stretch of grass sway in the evening breeze. She had come here many times before, seeking solitude, perhaps even waiting for something, though she didn't know what. Then suddenly a presence. Across the field, standing still as a statue, was a wild horse. Its dark eyes locked onto hers, unblinking, almost as if peering into her very soul. It wasn't fearsome, nor was it restless. No, this was different. There was something in the way it stared, something deep, something knowing. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. The woman's heart pounded. Horses were unpredictable, powerful. What was it thinking? Was it about to charge? Should she call for help? But she couldn't look away, and neither could the horse. Then, without warning, it moved. One slow step forward, then another. She gripped the armrests of her wheelchair. No one else was around. No fences, no barriers, no way to escape. And yet, something inside her whispered, "Don't be afraid." But could she trust that feeling? As the distance between them closed, her breath caught in her throat. What was this wild creature about to do? And that is where this story takes a turn no one could have ever predicted. Stay with me, because what happens next will not only surprise you, it will make you question everything you thought you knew about the connection between humans and animals. Before we unravel the mystery of this wild horse's actions, we need to understand the woman sitting there, alone in her wheelchair. Because, as you'll soon realize, she wasn't just any ordinary passerby. Her story was far more profound than it seemed. Her name was Eleanor, a woman who had lived through more than most could imagine. Once, she had been full of life, riding horses freely as the wind, her laughter echoing through open fields. But time is an unforgiving force. Age stole her strength, and an accident many years ago took away her ability to walk. Since then, she had spent her days watching life from the sidelines rather than running alongside it. Yet, despite everything, Eleanor never stopped coming to this place. This meadow, where wild horses still roamed, where nature hadn't yet surrendered to the concrete world. It was the last connection she had to the life she once knew. But today was different. She had come here expecting the usual, a quiet afternoon, the rustling of leaves, the distant neighs of horses that never came close. She never expected to be noticed, to be seen. And yet, in the vastness of this open field, a wild horse had found her, chosen her. Was it a coincidence? A simple act of curiosity? Or was there something far greater at play? Think about it. Of all the places this horse could have gone, of all the people it could have approached, it had locked onto her. Now, at her age, Eleanor thought she had seen everything. But even she couldn't explain what was happening. And as the horse took another step forward, then another, a strange thought entered her mind. Was this truly happening? Or was it a message? Because sometimes, the most extraordinary encounters don't just happen by chance, they happen for a reason. And in the next few moments, Eleanor was about to discover exactly what that reason was. Eleanor sat frozen in her wheelchair, her breath shallow, her heart pounding like a distant drum. The wild horse was no longer a mere silhouette in the golden light. It was coming closer, its every step measured, deliberate, almost calculated. But why? Wild horses were cautious by nature. They avoided humans, especially in open spaces where they had the freedom to run. And yet, this one was doing something different. It wasn't spooked, it wasn't retreating, it was approaching. Eleanor had lived long enough to know that animals had their own unspoken language, a way of sensing things beyond human understanding. And right now, she could feel it. This wasn't just curiosity. There was intent behind the horse's every movement. Was it a sign of danger? Was it testing her, deciding whether she was a threat? Or was it something else entirely? The air between them was thick with an unspoken tension, the kind that makes your skin tingle, your instincts sharpen. The horse lowered its head slightly, its deep, knowing eyes locked onto hers. It was searching for something. Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached out, just slightly, just enough to let the horse see she meant no harm. And then, it did something unexpected. It didn't flinch. It didn't turn away. Instead, it let out the softest breath, a warm exhale that brushed against the cool evening air. For a moment, Eleanor forgot she was in a wheelchair, forgot her age, her frailty. In that instant, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt seen. And then the horse took another step closer. Eleanor's mind raced. What was it trying to tell her? This wasn't just an encounter. This was something deeper, a connection forming in silence, in the space between two souls who had both lost something, yet somehow found each other. But just as Eleanor thought she understood what was happening, the horse made its move, and that was the moment that changed everything. For a moment, everything else faded. The gentle sway of the grass, the chirping of distant birds, even the cool breeze against Eleanor's skin. It was just her and the wild horse. The creature stood close now, so close that she could see the fine details of its coat, the way its muscles twitched beneath its skin, the rhythm of its breath. It didn't move erratically or show any signs of aggression. Instead, it simply watched her, as if it was waiting. Waiting for what? Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as she lifted her hand again, this time more deliberately. It was a movement she hadn't made in years, not toward a horse, not with this kind of trust. Would it run? Would it retreat? But then, something remarkable happened. The wild horse leaned in, closing the final distance between them. It lowered its head, pressing its velvety muzzle gently against her fragile palm. The warmth of its breath sent a shiver up her spine. This wasn't just curiosity. This wasn't just an animal exploring its surroundings. This was recognition. But how? How could a wild horse, a creature that had never known her, never been tamed by human hands, share such an intimate, wordless moment? Eleanor's eyes burned with unshed tears. It had been so long since she had felt this kind of closeness, this kind of connection. And then, the horse did something that sent a shudder through her entire being. It let out a slow, deep sigh, and before Eleanor could even process what was happening, it knelt right there in front of her. This magnificent, untamed being bent its legs and lowered itself until it was nearly level with her in the wheelchair, as if it understood. A lump formed in Eleanor's throat. Was this a sign of submission, a gesture of trust, or something even more profound? It wasn't just an encounter anymore, it was a message. She had spent years feeling invisible, bound to her chair, watching life pass her by. But in this moment, in the middle of this quiet field, a wild horse, a creature of freedom, of movement, had chosen her, had seen her not as someone broken or weak, but as someone worthy of this rare, sacred moment. The weight of it was almost too much to bear. Eleanor wanted to speak, to whisper words of gratitude, of awe, but she knew words weren't needed here. This was something far beyond language. But just as she thought she had grasped the depth of what was happening, the horse lifted its head, its ears flicking, its body tensing as if it sensed something. And then, just like that, it stood up, turned slightly, and did something Eleanor never could have expected. Something that would make her question whether this was just a chance encounter or something much, much greater. Eleanor barely had time to process the weight of what had just happened. A wild horse, a creature of pure instinct and untamed spirit, had not only acknowledged her presence, but had knelt before her, as if recognizing something beyond what human words could explain. But then, the air around them shifted. The horse suddenly lifted its head, its ears flicking toward an unseen force, its muscles tensed and its eyes sharpened with a newfound intensity. Something had changed. It wasn't fear, no, this was something else. A decision had been made. And then, it moved. In one fluid motion, the horse rose to its full height and stepped behind Eleanor's wheelchair. She barely had time to react before she felt something press gently against the back of her chair. A nudge. A firm, deliberate nudge. Eleanor's breath hitched. Was she imagining this? Was the horse pushing her? She reached for the wheels instinctively, but before she could do anything, another push came. This time, stronger. It wasn't random. It wasn't playful. It was purposeful. The realization sent shivers down her spine. This wild horse, this untamed, free creature was trying to move her. But why? Was it leading her somewhere, trying to help her? Was it remembering something? Or someone? Eleanor's heart pounded. She had spent years in this chair, believing her movement was limited, that she was bound to the same paths, the same routines. But now, here she was, in the middle of a field, being guided by a force of nature itself. A nervous laugh bubbled in her throat. "All right then," she murmured, gripping the arms of her chair. "Where are we going?" As if in response, the horse nudged her again, this time turning her slightly toward the trees at the far end of the meadow. And that's when Eleanor noticed something she hadn't before. A faint, almost hidden path leading through the trees. A path she had never explored, a path she had never even considered. Was this coincidence or fate? Her pulse quickened as she realized this wasn't just an act of curiosity from the horse. It was something far bigger. It was a sign, and whatever lay ahead, Eleanor was about to find out. Eleanor's heart pounded as she stared at the path before her. She had sat in this field countless times, watched the seasons change, listened to the distant calls of wild horses, but she had never noticed this. A narrow, hidden trail winding through the trees, as if waiting to be discovered. And now, this wild horse, this mysterious, untamed creature, was leading her straight toward it. Another nudge, gentle, insistent. Eleanor's breath hitched. Was she really about to follow? She hesitated, gripping the arms of her wheelchair. It had been years since she'd ventured beyond the open spaces where she felt safe. The uneven ground, the unknown ahead, it all whispered caution. Fear tried to creep in, but then the horse turned its head, looking at her once more. Its eyes weren't just deep, they were knowing, as if it understood, as if it was telling her, "Trust me." And so, against every doubt, every hesitation, Eleanor placed her hands on the wheels and rolled forward. The horse stepped in sync beside her, moving slowly, deliberately, as if making sure she wouldn't be left behind. With each turn of the wheels, Eleanor felt something stir within her, something she hadn't felt in years. Freedom. The path was uneven, covered in patches of grass and scattered leaves, but the horse remained by her side, steady, unwavering. Whenever she struggled to push forward, It nudged her ever so gently, as if encouraging her to keep going. It was a sight no one would believe, a wild horse guiding an elderly woman in a wheelchair down a hidden path, as if fate itself had written this moment into the fabric of time. And then she saw it, a break in the trees, a clearing bathed in golden sunlight. Eleanor gasped. She had never been here before. Not once, in all the years she had sat in that field, had she known this place existed. And yet, somehow, this horse had known. Tears welled in her eyes as she took it all in, the beauty, the stillness, the feeling that she had arrived somewhere she was always meant to be. But why? Why had this horse brought her here? And that's when she noticed something that made her heart stop. Something, or someone, was waiting for her. And in that moment, Eleanor realized this journey was far from over. The true reason she had been led here was about to be revealed. Eleanor's hands trembled on the wheels of her chair as she stared at the clearing before her. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting golden patches across the soft grass. The air was thick with an eerie stillness, as if the entire world had paused, waiting for what would come next. And then she saw it. At first it was just a silhouette in the distance, but as her eyes adjusted, her breath caught in her throat. A wooden structure, old and weathered, stood at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't just any structure, it was a stable. But how? Eleanor had lived in this town for decades. She had spent years coming to this meadow, watching the wild horses roam freely. Not once had she seen this stable, not even heard whispers of its existence. It was as if it had been hidden. Until now. The wild horse beside her let out a soft nicker, as if urging her forward. Eleanor's pulse quickened. She didn't know what she was expecting, but something deep in her soul told her that this was why the horse had brought her here. She swallowed hard and rolled closer. The stable door was slightly ajar, its wood worn with time. Her fingers brushed against the rough surface, and for a moment, memories flooded her. Memories of a past she had tried to forget. She had once been a rider, a lover of horses, a woman who lived for the thrill of galloping across endless fields. But that was before the accident, before the wheelchair, before she convinced herself that part of her life was over. She took a deep breath and peered inside, and that's when she saw it, a name carved into the old wooden wall. Her name, Eleanor. Her heart stopped. How? How was this possible? Who had put it here? The wild horse beside her let out another breath, nudging her gently, as if to say, "You were meant to find this." Tears blurred Eleanor's vision. This place. It wasn't new, it wasn't unknown. It was hers. A place she had once loved, once cherished. A place she had lost to time, to pain, to the belief that she would never return. And yet, this wild horse, this untamed spirit, had led her back. To her past, to herself. But why now? Why this horse? And what did it all mean? Eleanor's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths as she turned to the horse, as if searching for answers. And then she noticed something she had overlooked before. A marking, a scar, a familiar mark on the horse's flank, one she hadn't seen in years. Eleanor's breath hitched. She knew this horse, and in that moment, everything she thought she understood shattered. Because this wasn't just any wild horse. This was her horse, the one she had lost, the one she had thought was gone forever. The truth was finally clear. This was no ordinary encounter. This was destiny, and what happened next would prove it. Eleanor's entire world tilted as the realization hit her like a crashing wave. The wild horse standing before her, the one that had led her through the meadow, the one that had guided her to this forgotten stable, wasn't just any horse. It was her horse, her beloved companion from decades ago, the one she had ridden as a young woman, the one that had carried her across these very fields when she was free, strong, unburdened by the weight of time. But how? How could this be? She had lost him long ago. He had disappeared, vanished into the wild, never to be seen again. She had grieved him, let go of him, convinced herself that he had either been taken or had passed on, swallowed by the wilderness. And yet, here he was, standing before her, unchanged by the years, as if he had been waiting for her. Eleanor's hands clutched the arms of her wheelchair, her breath unsteady. She searched his body, his face, desperate for more proof, for something, anything, to tell her she wasn't imagining this. And then she saw it. A scar. A small, unmistakable scar near his shoulder. Her heart clenched. It was the same scar he had gotten as a young stallion after a thorn bush had cut him during one of their many rides together. She had tended to that wound herself, spent nights by his side, whispering to him as he healed. There was no denying it now. This wasn't just a resemblance. This wasn't a look-alike. It was him. Eleanor felt the floodgates open, hot tears spilling down her cheeks. She reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers barely brushing his muzzle before he leaned into her touch. Soft, familiar, full of unspoken emotion. And in that moment, the years melted away. She wasn't just an elderly woman in a wheelchair. She wasn't just someone left behind by time. She was Eleanor, the girl who once rode wild and free. The girl who had loved this horse with all her heart. And now, after all these years, he had found his way back to her. But how? Had he been searching for her all this time? Had he always been nearby, waiting for the right moment? Or was this something greater, a force beyond human understanding, a miracle written in the stars? Eleanor didn't know, but she did know one thing. This wasn't the end of their story. It was a new beginning. And what happened next would be nothing short of extraordinary. Eleanor sat frozen, her hand resting against the horse's muzzle, her fingers tracing the familiar contours of a face she thought she'd never see again. The tears in her eyes blurred the details, but she didn't need to see clearly. She felt the truth in her soul. After all these years, after all the loss, the grief, the silent longing, her horse had come back to her. But why now? The question echoed in her mind like a whisper from fate itself. She had spent years convincing herself that her best days were behind her, that the open fields, the thrill of the wind against her face, the untamed joy of galloping across endless meadows, were nothing more than memories. But this horse, this wild, beautiful, impossible horse, had shattered that belief. Had he been waiting for her, watching over her all this time? Had he sensed that she needed him now more than ever? A shuddering breath left her lips as she glanced down at her wheelchair. It had defined her life for so long, her limitations, her fears, her quiet acceptance of what she thought was her fate. But what if it wasn't? The horse took a step back and tossed his head, his mane catching the golden light of the clearing. There was something expectant in his eyes, something urging her forward. And then, in a move that made her heart stop, he knelt, right there in front of her, just as he had before. An invitation, a challenge, a call to remember who she once was. Eleanor's breath came in uneven gasps. Could she do it? Could she really climb onto his back after all these years? Logic told her no, that she was too old, too weak, that she had long since lost the ability to ride. But her heart told a different story. A story of trust, of faith, of believing in something greater than fear. Her hands trembled as she reached for his mane, her fingers curling into the thick strands. The sensation was electric, familiar yet foreign, like touching a piece of her past that had come alive again. The horse remained perfectly still, patient, as if knowing the weight of this moment. Eleanor took a deep breath, and then she moved. With strength she didn't know she still had, she pulled herself forward. Her body ached, her muscles screamed in protest, but she ignored it. She gritted her teeth, used every ounce of determination left in her soul, and she swung her leg over, and suddenly she was no longer just an elderly woman in a wheelchair. She was a rider again. The realization hit her with the force of a storm. She was on him. She was riding again. A laugh bubbled from her throat, half disbelief, half sheer exhilaration. And the horse? He stood slowly, carefully, making sure she was balanced before turning his head slightly, as if asking her the same silent question he had all along. "Are you ready?" Eleanor's fingers tightened in his mane. She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she whispered. And with that, the horse took his first step forward, not just into the clearing, but into a future she never thought she'd have again. The moment the horse took his first step, Eleanor felt something awaken deep inside her, something she thought had been lost forever. The rhythmic movement, the gentle sway of his body beneath her, the warmth of his coat against her legs. It was all so familiar, yet impossibly new. She had spent years in her wheelchair, believing that her days of freedom, of adventure, of riding were over. But now, here she was, perched atop the very horse that had once been her closest companion, moving through the world in a way she never dreamed possible again. A breathless laugh escaped her lips, part disbelief, part sheer exhilaration. The horse paused for a moment as if waiting, giving her time to settle, to trust. And then, with a gentle flick of his ears, he began to move faster. Eleanor's grip tightened on his mane, but there was no fear, only trust. The trees blurred past them as he carried her through the hidden path, the golden light of the setting sun filtering through the branches. The wind brushed against her face, lifting her silver hair, whispering secrets of the past and promises of the future. For the first time in years, she wasn't bound by limitations. She wasn't defined by her wheelchair. She wasn't trapped in the past. She was free. Tears streamed down her cheeks, not from sorrow, but from pure, unfiltered joy. She had forgotten what it felt like to live like this, to feel the power of a horse beneath her, to move in harmony with something so wild and untamed. The horse let out a soft nicker, as if sharing in her happiness, and then, just as he had done all those years ago, he ran. Not a cautious trot, not a hesitant step, a full, powerful gallop. Eleanor gasped, the rush of speed sending a jolt of adrenaline through her veins. The world became a blur of colour and motion, the pounding of hooves against the earth echoing in her chest like a heartbeat. And she remembered. She remembered what it felt like to race against the wind, to trust her horse completely, to feel like nothing, not time, not age, not even fate itself, could hold her back. It was as if the years melted away. She was no longer an elderly woman rediscovering a lost part of herself. She was Eleanor, the rider, the fearless spirit, the woman who had always belonged in the saddle. Her laughter rang out across the meadow, wild and free, blending with the sound of hooves pounding the earth. This was a miracle. This was life. And for the first time in decades, Eleanor wasn't just existing, she was living. But little did she know, this ride wasn't just about reclaiming her past, it was about changing her future forever.